The day Frances Fairchild walked into the Harlan County courthouse with nothing but the deed to her land, a dress that had been mended so many times the original fabric was barely recognizable, and a voice she had not truly used since her husband's burial, the whole town of Millstone Creek, Texas, held its breath without even knowing it needed to. It was the spring of 1882, and the dust had not yet settled from the winter that had taken everything from her. It had taken her husband, Robert Fairchild, 3 months prior, claimed by a fever that no doctor in the county could name with any certainty. It had taken 2 of her cattle to the same bitter cold that swept down from the panhandle and froze the creek solid for 6 weeks. And now, in the warm cruelty of April, it seemed intent on taking the last thing she had left, the 240 acres that she and Robert had broken their backs to build into something worth passing on to their daughter, Clara, who was 7 years old and presently sitting in the back of their neighbor Edna Holloway's wagon, waiting with wide and frightened eyes. Frances was 31 years old. She had married Robert at 19, had labored alongside him for 12 years on that land, had buried 2 babies before Clara came and stayed, and she had never once in her life begged anyone for anything. She did not intend to start today. What she intended was to make the men inside that courthouse understand that the mortgage they were calling due, the one taken out under duress when Robert was already sick, and the bank manager, a man by the name of Gerald Cobb, had presented himself at her door with paperwork, and a smooth smile was not a fair instrument of law. It was a thing built in desperation and signed under conditions that no woman with a clear mind and full knowledge would have agreed to. Cobb had given her 60 days to pay $120, a sum that might as well have been $1,000, and the 60 days had run out. The courthouse was a squat, 2-story limestone building that sat at the center of Millstone Creek's Main Street, flanked on one side by the land office and on the other by the Cattlemen's Trust, which was the very bank that held her debt. The irony was not lost on her. She pushed through the heavy oak door and entered the main hall, where benches lined the walls and a clerk's desk sat opposite a raised platform where Judge Howard Linfield presided over the business of Harlan County. There were perhaps 15 men inside that room, ranchers, some of them, a few town merchants, Gerald Cobb himself, seated in the front row with his lawyer, a man named Silas Trent whose suits always seemed slightly too fine for a place like Millstone Creek. There were 2 deputies standing near the wall, their hands hooked in their belts, and there was one man Frances did not recognize. He sat in the back row, slightly apart from the others, hat resting on his knee rather than his head, which she noticed immediately because most men in a courtroom left their hats on as if removing them cost them something. He was tall even seated, broad in the shoulder, with dark hair that carried a trace of dust from the road, and a jaw that suggested he had not been stationary long enough to shave properly in several days. He wore a plain canvas shirt, dark trousers, and boots that had seen more miles than comfort. His eyes, when they briefly caught hers as she entered, were a steady, unremarkable gray, and yet there was nothing unremarkable about the quality of attention behind them. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he is genuinely trying to understand, and then he looked away. Frances did not have the time or the luxury of curiosity. She walked to the front of the room and took her place standing before the judge's platform, because there was no chair provided for her. Judge Linfield peered over his spectacles with the tired authority of a man who had presided over too many hearings to find any particular one interesting. "Frances Fairchild," he said, as though confirming the presence of a piece of furniture. "Yes, Your Honor," she said. "We are here on the matter of the foreclosure proceeding initiated by Cattlemen's Trust of Millstone Creek against the property held in the name of Robert Fairchild, deceased, said property comprising 240 acres in the eastern section of Harlan County, described in the deed of record dated March the 8th, 1872. He paused, shuffled a paper. "The bank's attorney will present the terms of the outstanding debt. Mrs. Fairchild, you will have an opportunity to respond." Silas Trent rose with the particular confidence of a man who had never once in his professional life worried about losing. He laid out the case in precise, bloodless language. Robert Fairchild had borrowed $120 against the property in February of that year, shortly before his death. The note was signed and witnessed. Payment was due in full after 60 days. No payment had been made. The bank was within its lawful rights to foreclose. The whole presentation took perhaps 4 minutes. Frances had spent 3 weeks preparing what she wanted to say. She had written it out, then crossed it out, then written it again. She had rehearsed it standing at the kitchen window while Clara slept, her voice low and careful, working through each point the way Robert used to work through a difficult fence line, post by post, wire by wire. She had consulted old newspapers, read every word she could find about property law in Texas, and had even written a letter to a lawyer in Austin who had written back with 3 sentences of general sympathy and no specific help. She began, "Your Honor, the note my husband signed on February the 14th of this year was signed by a man in the final stage of a fever that had already taken his full capacity for sound judgment." Her voice was level. She had promised herself it would be. "I was present when Mr. Cobb arrived at our house that morning. My husband had not been out of bed in 11 days. He could not hold a spoon without assistance. Mr. Cobb presented the papers to him in our bedroom while I was outside attending to the livestock. By the time I came inside and understood what had occurred, Robert had already signed, and Mr. Cobb had already left." She could feel the stillness in the room, not the polite stillness of men listening, but the particular stillness of men waiting for her to stop. She did not stop. "I am not a lawyer, and I do not pretend to understand every instrument of law that governs this county. But I know that a contract signed by a man who cannot hold a spoon is not a contract signed by a man with sound mind. I know that Mr. Cobb was fully aware of my husband's condition, because my husband's condition was known to every person in this town with eyes. I know that the property in question was not purchased with bank money. It was purchased with money that Robert's father left him, in cash, in 1872, and the deed is clear on that. The only thing the bank holds is a note for a debt that should never have been presented to a dying man in his bedroom." Silas Trent cleared his throat and began to rise. "Mrs. Fairchild, with respect," he began. "I am not finished," Frances said, and she was not. She turned slightly so that her words reached the whole room, not just the judge. "What is being taken from me today is not a piece of land. It is a homestead that 2 people built from nothing. It is the place where my daughter was born and where her father is buried. It is the only security I have to offer her in a world that, as this room can attest, provides precious little security to women on their own. I am asking this court to look at the circumstances under which that note was signed and find them insufficient to support a lawful foreclosure. I am asking for nothing I have not earned." The silence that followed was absolute. And then, before Judge Linfield had drawn breath to respond, before Silas Trent had finished composing his next objection, before even Frances herself had turned fully back to face the bench, the man in the back row rose to his feet. Every head in the room turned. He stood with a quietness that was somehow more commanding than noise. He held his hat still in one hand, and he looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor," he said. His voice was unhurried and clear, the kind of voice that did not need to be raised to carry. "My name is David Prescott. I am an attorney, licensed in the state of Texas, currently practicing in Austin. I am also, as of 2 weeks ago, admitted to practice in Harlan County courts, my registration having been filed with the clerk on April the 3rd. He reached into the breast pocket of his canvas shirt and produced a folded document, which he held up briefly before setting it on the bench nearest him. "I happened to be passing through Millstone Creek on a matter of personal business when I became aware of this proceeding. I would ask the court's indulgence to speak to several points of Texas contract law that bear directly on the question of this note's validity." Judge Linfield studied him for a long moment. Silas Trent had gone the color of old chalk. "You are admitted, Mr. Prescott," the judge said. David Prescott walked to the front of the room without hurry, and Frances Fairchild stepped slightly to the side to allow him room, and their eyes met for the first time at close range, and she thought something she immediately set aside, which was that he had the kind of face that made you feel like the world might be slightly less unreliable than you had assumed. He cited from memory 3 specific provisions of Texas property law regarding the validity of contracts entered into by parties under mental incapacity. He cited the case of Henderson versus the Texas Land Trust, decided in 1879, which had established a precedent in the state for voiding mortgage instruments signed by parties who could be demonstrated to have lacked sound judgment at the time of signing. He pointed out that the note in question had been signed by a man who died 11 days later, which, he observed dryly, strongly suggested his condition at signing had been well beyond the threshold of sound mind. He also noted that the bank had failed to provide Frances with any written notice of the foreclosure proceeding in advance, which was required by statute, and that the deed of original purchase made no mention of the cattleman's trust as a party, suggesting the bank had no prior recorded interest in the property that would give the note priority. He spoke for approximately 12 minutes. He was precise, organized, and utterly without theater, which made him more effective than if he had been dramatic, because there was nowhere for Gerald Cobb or Silas Trent to grab hold of the presentation and wrestle it into something emotional. Judge Linfield listened with increasing attentiveness. By the time David Prescott concluded, the judge had removed his spectacles entirely and was rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Mr. Trent," the judge said, "I'll hear your response." Silas Trent gave one. It was competent and it was well argued, and it was, ultimately, insufficient because David Prescott had walked into that room with the kind of preparation that suggested this had not, in fact, been an accident of his travel route. Judge Linfield ruled that the foreclosure proceeding was suspended, pending a formal review of the note's validity under Texas contract law, specifically the mental capacity provisions Mr. Prescott had cited. He gave the bank 30 days to present evidence rebutting the capacity argument, and he gave Frances Fairchild 30 days to produce witnesses to her husband's condition at the time of signing, evidence she had in abundance, because the entire town of Millstone Creek had watched Robert Fairchild die by degrees, and every last one of them could testify to it. The bank did not wait 30 days. Gerald Cobb, it seemed, had no interest in having a county judge examine too closely the exact circumstances of how he had come to be in a dying man's bedroom with loan paperwork, and within 2 weeks his lawyer had reached a settlement, withdrawing the foreclosure action entirely in exchange for Frances repaying the principal amount of the loan at a rate of $5 per month over 2 years, interest-free. Frances could manage $5 a month. She had already decided she would take in laundry, sell eggs from the 3 hens she had left, and plant the south field in corn, which could be sold to the feed store in town. She could keep her land. She could keep her daughter's home. She could keep the place where Robert was buried beneath the old cottonwood that grew beside the creek. But all of that came after. What came immediately after the hearing was the afternoon, and the afternoon began with Frances pushing out through the courthouse doors into the warm April sunlight and stopping dead on the front steps, because she suddenly had no idea what to do with her legs. The tension that had held her upright through the entire proceeding seemed to dissolve all at once, and she gripped the iron railing at the top of the steps and breathed carefully, in through her nose and out through her mouth, the way her mother had taught her when she was a girl in Georgia and the world felt too large. "Mrs. Fairchild," she turned. David Prescott had come out behind her and was standing 2 steps below her, which brought them to roughly the same height, and she looked at him directly for the first time without a room full of observers between them. "Mr. Prescott," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I believe I owe you a considerable debt." "You owe me nothing," he said. You made the argument, I only supplied the citations. That is extremely gracious and also not accurate, she said, and something in her voice made the corner of his mouth move just slightly. You rose before I had finished speaking. Because you had already said what needed saying, he replied. The legal framework was in your argument. I only made it legible to a judge who needed the statute numbers. She looked at him for a moment. He looked back at her. The street behind them was busy with the ordinary afternoon traffic of Millstone Creek, a wagon loaded with lumber, 2 riders heading south, a woman in a blue dress hurrying into the dry goods store, and it all felt very far away. You said you were passing through on personal business, she said. I did say that. Is that true? He held her gaze. I was in the area. I became aware of the proceeding. There was something in that answer that was neither complete nor dishonest, and she filed it away to examine later when she had the mental space for it. Will you stay in Millstone Creek? She asked and then immediately wondered why she had asked it, because it was not a question she had planned to ask. I have not decided, he said. I have been without a fixed location for some time. She nodded. She did not press. She was not in the habit of pressing. Then I hope you will allow me to offer you a meal, she said, if you are still in Millstone Creek this evening. It is the very least I can do. He studied her for a moment, and she had the sense that he was weighing something that had nothing to do with the dinner invitation and everything to do with something more complicated. I will be here this evening, he said. She found Clara in the back of Edna Holloway's wagon, exactly where she had left her, curled up small with her knees drawn to her chest and her fists pressed together in her lap. And when she saw Frances come around the corner of the wagon, the child's entire face rearranged itself in a way that was almost painful to witness. The careful blankness collapsing into relief so large it looked like something breaking open. "Mama," Clara said. "We are all right," Frances said, and lifted her daughter down from the wagon and held her hard. "We are all right. We are keeping the house." Clara buried her face in Frances's shoulder and did not speak, but her small arms gripped with the particular ferocity of a child who has been holding very still for a very long time. Edna Holloway, who was a wide, warm woman of 50 with an opinion on most subjects and the wisdom to withhold it when wisdom was required, put her hand briefly on Frances's back. "Good news?" Edna asked. "Good enough," Frances said. "For now." She told Edna about David Prescott on the drive home, partly because Edna would find out anyway and partly because saying it out loud helped Frances understand what had happened. A lawyer, traveling through, had spoken up on her behalf. The judge had suspended the foreclosure. Edna listened with the focused attention of a woman who understood that the details mattered. "A lawyer," Edna repeated. "From Austin, you said." "That is what he said, passing through. That is what he said." Edna was quiet for a moment. "And you invited him to supper." "I did." Another silence. "Well," Edna said, in a tone that contained an entire conversation Frances was not ready to have, "I suppose that is the very least." The farmhouse sat at the end of a half-mile of rutted track that ran from the main road through a stand of mesquite trees and out into the open land where the fields began. The house itself was a solid limestone structure with 2 rooms downstairs and a sleeping loft above, built by Robert's hands mostly, with some help from neighbors during the community raising that Millstone Creek organized when the Fairchilds first arrived. There was a covered porch along the front, a kitchen garden that had gone a little wild since February, and behind the house, the barn and the small stone-walled enclosure where the 3 surviving hens ruled their small domain with considerable opinion. Frances spent the afternoon in a state of peculiar energy. She cleaned the kitchen, which did not strictly need cleaning but which gave her hands something to do. She checked on her small stores of food and made a decision about supper. She would make a proper meal, the best she could manage, which would be corn bread and a rabbit stew built on stock she had stored from a previous week's cooking. It was not fancy, but it was honest food and she was not ashamed of it. She also changed her dress. She told herself this was purely practical. as the dress she had worn to court carried the particular stiffness of formal occasion and was not comfortable for an evening at home. The second dress, which was a dark blue wool that Robert had once said made her look like she was carrying the night sky around with her, was marginally better in condition and considerably more comfortable. She put it on without particular ceremony and declined to think further about it. David Prescott arrived at 6 o'clock on a gray horse that needed a good feeding and a rest, which Frances noticed immediately and told him so. "The livery in town is closed by this hour," she said, coming off the porch steps to meet him. "Put him in my barn. There is hay enough." He looked at her for a moment, then looked at his horse, then did what she said. Clara stood on the porch and watched him with the frank, unguarded stare of a 7-year-old. And when he led the horse around the side of the house and caught Clara's eye, he gave her a very small, very serious nod, as though she were a person whose opinion mattered to him, and Clara immediately softened in the way that children do when adults treat them with accidental respect. Supper was a quiet thing at first. The three of them sat at the kitchen table, Frances at one end, David Prescott across from Clara, and Clara at the other end, watching him with the systematic attention of a child conducting a private investigation. He ate with appreciation and without pretension, complimented the corn bread specifically, and answered Clara's questions, which began after about 10 minutes with the same unhurried honesty with which he seemed to approach everything. "Do you have a horse of your own, or is that one you borrowed?" Clara asked. "He is mine," David said. "His name is Ridley." "That is a strange name for a horse." "It was the name he already had when I got him." Clara considered this. "Do you keep him inside at night or outside?" "Outside, generally, unless the weather is very bad." "We keep ours inside," Clara said, with the particular satisfaction of a child whose domestic arrangements have been validated. "Mama says it is because our barn is sturdier than most." David looked at Frances over Clara's head, and Frances found herself almost smiling. "Your mother seems like a woman who makes sound decisions," he said. "She is," Clara said simply, and returned to her corn bread. After Clara was put to bed, the child went without protest, which Frances attributed to the exhaustion of a long and frightening day. Frances made coffee at the stove and brought 2 cups to the kitchen table and sat down, and for a while the two of them were simply quiet together in a way that was surprisingly easy. "Tell me truly," Frances said finally. "You were not just passing through." He looked at his coffee cup. "I had read about the proceeding in the county notices," he said. "I was in Harlan County for another matter that concluded last week, a land dispute between 2 ranchers. I was preparing to return to Austin when I saw the notice of the foreclosure hearing and something about the circumstances of it, the circumstances you described today, which matched what I had heard in town, gave me reason to be present." "You came to help me," she said. "I came to observe," he said. "I was not certain, until I heard you speak, that intervention was appropriate. You were making the argument well. I only rose when I saw that Linfield was not going to act on the argument without someone presenting the statutory framework." "Why?" she asked. "You had no connection to me, no obligation." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a night bird called somewhere in the mesquite, and the kitchen lamp threw a warm, unsteady light across the table. "I have seen this kind of proceeding before," he said. "Men like Cobb who move on women alone, believing they have no recourse. I have seen it in 3 counties since I began practicing. It is not legal, what he did, and it seemed wrong to watch it happen when I had the means to prevent it." "That is a very decent reason," she said. "It is the only one I have." She looked at him. He was, she thought, genuinely tired. Not the tiredness of a single long day, but the accumulated tiredness of a man who had been moving a long time. There was something in his face beneath the composure that suggested he had not been entirely at ease in the world for some while. "Where are you from?" she asked. "Originally." "Missouri," he said. "A town called Culver near the Kansas border. I left at 23 to study law in Austin. I have been in Texas ever since." "How old are you now?" 34, she nodded. He looked at her with a question he did not ask, and she answered it anyway. "I am 31, she said. "Robert and I came to Texas from Georgia in 1870. He had family land here or the right to file on it. We built the house the first summer." "He sounds like a man who knew how to work," David said. "He did," she said. "He was a good man. He was a very good man." The way she said it was factual and fond and carried the particular quality of grief that has passed its acute stage and settled into the body as a permanent, bearable weight. David Prescott heard it exactly as she meant it, and did not offer sympathy or platitude, which she appreciated. They talked for another hour. About the land, about the law, about the peculiarities of practicing in rural Texas counties, where the judge might also be the largest landowner, and the concept of impartiality was more aspiration than reality. She told him about the corn she planned to plant, about the laundry business she was considering, about Clara's determination to learn to read before the fall term started. He told her about a case he had worked on the previous year, involving a ranching family in Harlan County, whose land had been seized under fraudulent tax claims, which he had eventually argued before the state circuit court and won. She found him easy to talk to, which surprised her, because she had not found anyone easy to talk to since Robert died. She had found people kind and patient and well-meaning, but easy in this specific sense. The sense of a conversation that builds and moves and surprises both people in it, she had not found. He left at 9:30, retrieving Ridley from the barn and saying good night from the saddle with a quietness that was neither awkward nor warm, simply present, and Frances stood on the porch and watched him ride down the track toward town, and then went inside and stood in the kitchen for a while looking at the 2 cups on the table, thinking about nothing in particular except that the world felt, very slightly, less terrifying than it had that morning. He came back 3 days later. She was in the south field with a hoe when she heard Ridley on the track, and she straightened up and shaded her eyes and watched him come. He had shaved, she noticed, and his shirt was clean. "I thought you were returning to Austin," she said when he was close enough. "I am," he said. "I have some business to settle in Millstone Creek first." "What business?" "I have spoken to Judge Linfield about the review process for the note. I want to make sure Cobb's attorney does not find a way to revive the proceeding on a technicality. There are 2 witnesses I need to take statements from regarding your husband's condition at the time of signing. Edna Holloway is one. She was willing. I also understand the minister at the Baptist church visited your husband in the week before the signing." She stared at him. "You are continuing to work on this?" "Until it is settled, yes." "I cannot pay you," she said. "I cannot pay you anything, Mr. Prescott. I did not ask to be paid. You cannot work for nothing. You have a practice to maintain." He looked at her with the steady gray eyes that she had been trying not to think about for 3 days. "Mrs. Fairchild, I have money enough. I am not a wealthy man, but I am not in need of your payment. Please allow me to do this." She opened her mouth to argue and then did not, because something in his expression told her that the argument would not land anywhere useful, and also because she was not, if she was being honest with herself, entirely unhappy about the fact that he had reasons to stay in Millstone Creek a while longer. "Then at least come to supper again," she said. "I will," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved again, and this time it became something that was almost a smile. Over the following 2 weeks, David Prescott came to supper 4 more times. He also, between those suppers, spent considerable time at the courthouse, at the land office, and in conversation with the minister, who turned out to remember the day of Robert's signing with great clarity, and was fully prepared to attest in writing that Robert Fairchild had been in no condition to conduct any business of legal consequence. He spent one afternoon at Edna Holloway's kitchen table drinking tea and taking down her recollections in careful, precise handwriting, and Edna afterward told Frances, with the measured tone of a woman parceling out information, that he was, in her estimation, a serious and thorough man. "He asked after you," Edna said. "He asks about the case," Frances said. "He asked about you," Edna repeated, with the particular patience of someone who has said something once and is simply waiting for the other person to catch up. Frances said nothing and changed the subject, and Edna allowed her to, because Edna understood the particular carefulness of a woman who has recently been grieving and is not yet sure if she has finished. The thing was, Frances was paying attention. She had told herself she was not, and she was wrong. She was paying attention to the way David Prescott sat at her kitchen table and was entirely present, not performing presence the way some men did, not looking past her toward his own thoughts, but actually listening when she spoke, actually hearing the things she said and the things she did not say. She was paying attention to the way he was with Clara, who had decided within the space of his second visit that he was acceptable, and had commenced treating him with the casual, demanding familiarity that Clara reserved for people she trusted. She was paying attention to the fact that he had ridden back to the farm on 4 separate occasions now, and each time he had found some reason that was legitimate and useful, but each time he had also stayed longer than the reason strictly required. She was also paying attention to the fact that she was looking forward to his visits, and that this was both unremarkable. She was lonely. She had been lonely for 3 months, and also not entirely explained by loneliness, because the specific forward-looking quality of her attention had a particular texture that she recognized from a very long time ago. She told herself to be careful. The settlement came on a Tuesday, the 23rd of April. Gerald Cobb withdrew the foreclosure action. Silas Trent delivered the formal withdrawal to the courthouse, with the studied neutrality of a man putting as much distance as possible between himself and a losing outcome. Judge Linfield signed the dismissal, and the Fairchild property, 240 acres in the eastern section of Harlan County, was free and clear of the bank's claim. Frances was in the courthouse when it happened, standing beside David Prescott, and when the judge signed the last document and set down his pen, she did not cry. She had told herself firmly in advance that she would not cry. What she did was stand very still for a moment and breathe, and then she looked at David Prescott and said, quietly and directly, "Thank you." He looked back at her. "It was your argument," he said for the second time. "Stop saying that," she said, and he blinked slightly and she almost laughed. They walked out into the April afternoon, which was brilliant and blue and warm enough to feel like a promise, and stood on the courthouse steps, and Frances realized with a mild internal shock that she did not know what happened now. The case was done. David Prescott had concluded his business in Millstone Creek. He had a practice in Austin that had presumably been unattended for 3 weeks. There was nothing to hold him here. She turned to look at him and found him already looking at her. "When will you leave?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I am in no great hurry," he said. "Your practice," she said. "I work independently. There is no partner waiting. My caseload in Austin is manageable from a distance for a period." He paused. "I had been thinking of establishing a practice closer to this county. There is significant need for legal services in Harlan County. The nearest competent practitioner, it seems, is currently Silas Trent, and I would not classify him as reliable." She looked at him steadily. "That is a practical consideration," she said. "It is," he agreed. "It has nothing to do with anything else," she said, and it was not a question. He met her gaze. "I would not say that," he said. "No, I would not say that at all." The spring in Millstone Creek arrived with generosity that year, as though compensating for the cruelty of the winter. The mesquite greened up early, the creek ran full and clear, and Frances's south field, which she had managed to plant in corn in the second week of May with the help of Edna Holloway's oldest son, and a mule borrowed from a neighbor, showed its first green rows by the end of the month and stood knee-high by the time June arrived with its long, hot days and soft evenings. David Prescott established himself in a rented room above the hardware store on Main Street and hung a single, modest sign outside that read simply, "David Prescott, Attorney at Law." He had 3 clients within the first week, which suggested that Edna Holloway had been correct about the need for legal services in the area. He began to be seen at the feed store, at the church on Sunday mornings, at the counter of the dry goods store where he bought coffee and writing paper, and people began to do what small towns do with strangers who prove themselves useful. They incorporated him, slowly and without ceremony, into the ordinary texture of their days. He came to the Fairchild farm on Sunday afternoons, which had somehow become established as a habit without either of them explicitly arranging it. He would arrive at around 2 o'clock on Ridley, who was filling out well on the hay Frances kept for him, and Clara would be waiting on the porch with a project or a question, or occasionally just herself, arms crossed and expression expectant. The three of them had settled into a Sunday rhythm. They would often walk the south field together, with Clara providing a running commentary on the corn and the hens and whatever creature she had observed in the creek that week. And then they would sit on the porch through the late afternoon and talk while the light changed and the evening came. It was in this way, slowly and practically and without drama, that Frances Fairchild and David Prescott began to know each other. Not in the concentrated, extraordinary way that courtship sometimes looked in stories, but in the ordinary and revelatory way that it actually worked, which was through accumulated hours and small conversations, and the particular intimacy of seeing someone in their unguarded moments. She saw him frustrated once, over a legal matter involving a widow in the next county whose case was not going well, and she saw that his frustration was turned entirely inward, at the limitations of law, never outward at the woman herself. She saw him patient with Clara in a way that was not performed patience but genuine ease, the ease of a man who was simply interested in what children thought. She saw him sit quietly with a cup of coffee on her porch and look out at the land with an expression she could not entirely interpret but which seemed to involve a kind of peace, as though the land was giving him something he needed. For his part, David watched Frances in the way that a man watches something that he cannot stop looking at and knows he should probably say something about. He watched her in the field, in the particular focused way she moved through work, efficient, unhurried, utterly competent. He watched her with Clara, the tenderness of it unguarded and unself-conscious, the two of them existing in a private world of mother and daughter that he felt privileged to occasionally be adjacent to. He watched her at the kitchen table on the evenings he stayed for supper, talking about things that mattered to her, the land, Clara's education, the question of whether the county would eventually build a proper schoolhouse, and thinking, with the particular accumulation that 3 months of Sunday afternoons produces, that she was one of the most genuinely admirable people he had encountered in his 34 years. He had been in love before. Once in Austin briefly, with a lawyer's daughter who had moved to San Francisco before anything came of it, and once before that in Missouri, with a schoolteacher who had married someone else. Both times it had been the straightforward, slightly bewildering emotion that he recognized as love from the outside, a disorientation of the senses, a preoccupation of the mind, but had not known entirely how to manage from the inside. What he felt for Frances Fairchild was the same thing but quieter and more certain and considerably more alarming, because she was a woman who had already weathered one enormous loss, and he was not interested in offering her anything he could not fully stand behind. He worked through it methodically, the way he worked through legal problems, which was to say he identified the material facts, considered the objections, and tried to be honest about his conclusions. The material facts were that he had been thinking about her every day for 3 months, that he looked forward to Sundays with a specificity that was embarrassing if he examined it closely, that he had found, without particularly trying, reasons to stay in a small town in Harlan County rather than return to his established life in Austin, and that while the legal practice here was genuinely rewarding and the town was a good one, he knew with complete honesty that the tipping weight in the decision had been Frances Fairchild and the possibility, which he had not yet acted on, of being in her life. The objections were that she was still relatively recently widowed, that he was a near stranger despite 3 months of acquaintance, that he did not know if she harbored any feeling for him that went beyond gratitude and comfortable friendship, and that raising the subject clumsily could damage the friendship, which he valued considerably. His conclusion arrived at on a warm Wednesday evening in mid-June, while sitting in his rented room above the hardware store and staring at a legal brief he had not written a word of in an hour, was that he was going to have to say something eventually, and that continuing to say nothing was its own kind of cowardice. He did not say anything the next Sunday. He said it the Sunday after, which was the first Sunday of July, during a late afternoon that had stretched into evening and then past supper, which had become rabid again because Francis had set a trap in the mesquite and it had produced, and David had offered to help skin the rabbit, which Francis had agreed to largely because she was curious whether he would actually do it competently, and he did, which she filed away as information about his character. Clara had gone up to the sleeping loft, protesting only slightly because David had promised to show her a knot he knew for fishing lines the following Sunday, and she wanted to extract the promise verbally before he left. He gave it solemnly, and she went upstairs mollified. They were on the porch in the warm dark, with the July insects singing in the grass and the stars beginning to come out one by one over the black outline of the mesquite, and the silence between them had the particular quality of two people who have been working up to something for some time and both know it and are simply deciding who will go first. David went first. "Francis," he said. She looked at him. In the dark, his face was a study in candlelight and shadow, the steady eyes watching her with the same quality of attention she had noticed the very first day in the courthouse, the quality that made her feel genuinely seen. "I am aware," he said carefully, "that it is not very long since you lost Robert. I am aware that I am, in many senses, still a recent arrival in your life. I want to say something to you, and I want to say it honestly, and I want you to know that whatever you say in response I will accept without difficulty, because your comfort and your ease in this friendship matter to me enormously." She waited. He drew a breath. "I have developed feelings for you," he said. "I have been developing them since the day you stood in that courthouse and spoke about what your land means to you and your daughter, and they have not diminished in the months since. They have, in fact, done the opposite." He paused. "I am not asking for anything. I only felt that it was dishonest to continue without saying it, and I would rather be honest with you than comfortable." The insects sang. The stars appeared. Frances Fairchild sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked at David Prescott, and felt, moving through her, something that she recognized from the deep past, but which had been so long absent that she had not quite allowed herself to name it while it was building. "How long have you been practicing that?" she asked. He blinked. "Pardon, what you just said, did you write it down?" "I know I did not write it down, though I did," he admitted with something that was the closest she had yet seen him come to self-consciousness. "Think about it for a considerable amount of time." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she said, "I have been paying attention to you, David Prescott, since March. I am aware of exactly what that means, and I am also aware that I have not been certain what to do about it." He was very still. "I am still careful," she said. "I am going to continue to be careful because I have Clara to think about and I do not take things lightly, but I want you to know that what you have said is received, and not unwelcome." The word unwelcome, delivered with precision and the faintest trace of warmth behind it, landed between them like a door opening. "I understand careful," he said. "I have been careful myself." "I know you have," she said. "I noticed." Something shifted in his face, the composed quietness giving way to something more transparent, and for just a moment she saw the man under the attorney, the serious and earnest and somewhat solitary person who had ridden into Millstone Creek in April, and who had, in the months since, been taking Sunday afternoons on her porch with the careful attention of someone building something he did not want to damage. "Then we proceed carefully," he said. "We proceed carefully," she agreed. There was a pause, and then, because neither of them had any particular talent for the performative gestures of romance, and because the evening was warm and honest and they were two people who said what they meant, Frances Fairchild put her hand on the porch rail between them, and David Prescott put his hand over hers, and they sat like that for a while in the July dark and said nothing at all, which was more than enough. The summer deepened. The corn grew. Frances's laundry business, which she had begun quietly in June, and which had grown by word of mouth to include 4 regular customers, provided a small but reliable additional income that sat alongside the $5 monthly payments she was sending to the bank, with the particular satisfaction of paying a debt she had not agreed to, but had decided to honor simply to be done with Gerald Cobb permanently. She planted a kitchen garden that produced in August with an almost offensive abundance, more squash than 3 people could eat in a month. Tomatoes she put up in glass jars that lined a whole shelf in the kitchen, sweet corn from the garden rows that Clara ate raw off the cob standing in the field, and considered this the highest pleasure of summer. David Prescott had 5 clients in July and 6 in August, which was not a fortune but was a living, and he had begun to be trusted in the way that lawyers are trusted in small communities, which is to say that people came to him, not only with legal problems, but with the quieter, vaguer category of trouble that has no statutory name, but benefits from a sensible person's attention. He helped a farmer write a will. He mediated a dispute between 2 brothers over the use of a shared well. He wrote a letter on behalf of a Mexican family in the county's southern section, who had been having their water rights interfered with by a neighboring rancher, and the letter was blunt and accurate and cited specific provisions of Texas water law, and the interference stopped. He rode out to the Fairchild farm on Sundays, always on Sundays, and sometimes on a Wednesday evening as well. And on those evenings, he and Frances developed the habit of sitting on the porch after Clara was in bed and talking in the easy, building way of people who are learning each other. She told him about Georgia, about her parents and her brothers, about the way the land there was so different from Texas that she had spent her first year feeling as though she had moved to another country. He told her about Missouri, about his father who had been a school teacher and his mother who had been formidably organized and deeply kind, both of them gone now, his father to a heart ailment and his mother to pneumonia the winter before David moved to Austin. He told her about law school, about the professor who had taught contract law and who had instilled in him the conviction that the law was only valuable if it actually functioned for ordinary people, which had shaped every professional decision he had made since. She told him, one evening in late August when the air had finally cooled enough to be comfortable after 9 o'clock, about the 2 babies she had lost before Clara. She told him quietly and directly, the way she approached everything painful, without flinching but without embellishment. 2 pregnancies, 2 early losses, the particular grief of loving something that existed only briefly and then did not. He listened without offering anything except his full attention, and when she was done he said, "I am sorry for those losses," and nothing else, which was exactly right. They did not kiss until September. It happened on a Sunday evening when Ridley was acting restive in the barn for reasons best known to himself, and David had gone to check on him and settle him, and Frances had followed because it was a reasonable thing to do, and also, she acknowledged privately, because she wanted to. The barn was dim and warm with the animal smell of hay and horses and chickens, and Ridley turned out to be merely bored, and David was stroking the horse's nose and talking to him quietly when Frances came in, and he turned at the sound of her step and found her much closer than he had expected. And the sequence of events that followed was extremely logical given the preceding 3 months of careful attention, and July evenings and hands on porch rails in the dark. He kissed her first, with a tentativeness that lasted about 2 seconds before she kissed him back, which resolved the tentativeness entirely. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was a real one, which was better. When they separated, both of them were breathing slightly differently, and Ridley turned his head and looked at them with the profound indifference of a horse that has seen human behavior before and rated it below adequate hay. Frances laughed. She had not laughed genuinely, from the center of herself, in a very long time, and the sound surprised her. David looked at her laughing in the barn light and smiled, the full version of the half-smile she had been seeing fragments of for months, and it turned out, as she had privately suspected, to be devastating. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. They walked back to the house in the September dark and sat on the porch again and talked for another hour, and when he left, she went inside and stood in the kitchen in the lamplight and held the feeling carefully, the way you hold something you are not sure will survive the night but want to give every chance. It survived. Through September and October, as the summer heat stepped back and the morning air carried the first clean edge of autumn, David Prescott and Frances Fairchild were cautious and deliberate, and increasingly unable to maintain the kind of distance that caution and deliberation seemed to require. He came on Sundays and Wednesdays and sometimes Fridays, and Clara, who had initially accepted his presence with 7-year-old pragmatism, had by October developed the kind of attachment to him that produced, one morning in the first week of October, a conversation that Frances was not quite prepared for. Clara was sitting at the kitchen table eating breakfast and Frances was at the stove, and Clara said, without preamble, "Is David going to stay forever?" Frances set down the pan she was holding. "What do you mean?" "I mean, is he going to live here?" Clara said, with the calm directness of a child who has thought the matter through. "Or is he going to keep living above the hardware store?" Frances turned around and looked at her daughter, who was eating her oatmeal and looking back at her with an expression of mild patience. "Why are you asking?" Frances said. "Because I think he should live here," Clara said. "He is over here all the time anyway, and Ridley likes our barn better than the livery, and also you are happier when he is here. You smile differently." Frances opened her mouth and closed it again. "I smile differently," she repeated. "Yes," Clara said. "You smile like things are funny again. You stopped doing that for a while after Papa died." She said it matter-of-factly, not as an accusation, simply as an observation about the world. "I liked it when things were funny." "David makes things funny again." She paused. "Not the same as Papa, different, but still good." Frances stood at the stove for a long moment. Then she went and sat down across from her daughter at the kitchen table and said, "Clara, you are a very remarkable person." "I know," Clara said. "Edna says so too." It was this conversation, more than anything else, that moved the balance in Frances from being careful to being honest, because Clara had said aloud what Frances had been turning over in her own mind for weeks and had been afraid to fully acknowledge. She was happy. Not in the way she had been happy with Robert. That happiness was its own irreplaceable thing, and she was not trying to replace it, but in a real way, a present way, the kind of happiness that comes from being known and seen, and treated with full honesty by someone whose character you trust. She told David about Clara's observation that Sunday evening, after Clara was in bed, and he listened with the expression of a man receiving information he intended to take seriously. "She is not wrong," he said after a moment. "No," Frances said, "she rarely is." He looked at his hands, then at her. "Frances, I have been thinking." "I know you have," she said. "I have been thinking as well. I do not want to rush you." "You are not rushing me. I am a grown woman, David. I have been through enough of life to know the difference between being rushed and being ready." "And are you," he asked, "ready?" She looked at him steadily. "I am not the girl who married Robert at 19, she said. "I am not uncertain about what I want or what I need or what I am willing to give. I love this land. I love my daughter. I have worked very hard to build a life that is mine." She paused. "And I have spent 6 months noticing that you fit into that life in a way that does not diminish any of it, that you add to it, that I am a better version of myself when you are around." He was very still. "I am not asking you to replace Robert," she said. "I am not asking you to be anything other than what you already are. I am simply telling you that what you said on the porch in July, that it was received and not unwelcome. Those were very small words for what is actually true. David Prescott looked at her in the lamplight of the kitchen where he had eaten supper on more evenings than he could now count, in the house that she had fought for and kept, and was filling slowly back up with ordinary daily life, and he said, "I want to marry you, Frances, if you will have me. I want to live on this land and practice law in this town and raise Clara and whatever other children God is willing to send us, and I want to do all of it beside you for the rest of my life." The last of the October wind moved against the window. The kitchen was warm. Somewhere upstairs Clara slept with the profound efficiency of children. "Yes," Frances said, "I will have you." They were married in November, on a Saturday that came out clear and cold, with a sky so blue it looked like something had been freshly washed. The ceremony was held at the Baptist Church on Main Street, performed by the same minister who had provided the statement about Robert's condition at the time of signing, a fact that Frances found satisfying in a way she could not precisely articulate, but which felt like the closing of a circle. Edna Holloway wore her good blue dress and cried at the appropriate moments and 2 extra moments besides. Clara wore a white ribbon in her hair that she had chosen herself and stood very straight beside her mother through the entire service, with the solemn concentration of a child who understands the weight of an occasion even if not all its specifics. There were perhaps 40 people in the church, which was most of the town and a fair portion of the county's farming families. Gerald Cobb was not present. Cobb had, in fact, been notably quieter in his professional dealings since the spring, and there was a rumor, not yet confirmed, that his arrangement with the Cattlemen's Trust was under scrutiny from the State Banking Commission, which Edna Holloway reported to Frances with the composed satisfaction of someone who has watched justice take its time and finally arrive. David Prescott stood at the altar in the best clothes he owned, which was a dark wool coat and clean white shirt, and watched Frances Fairchild come down the aisle on the arm of Edna's husband, Thomas, who had offered when it became clear that Frances had no male family member in the county, and he thought with a clarity that surprised him that this was one of the most plainly right things he had ever done. The words they exchanged were the standard words of the ceremony, but they said them to each other with an eye contact that gave each word its full weight, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife and David kissed her, he heard Clara from behind them say, audibly, "Good," which produced a ripple of laughter through the whole church, and Frances, still close to him, laughed again the way she had laughed in the barn in September, from the center of herself. And he thought that sound was one of the best things in the world. The reception was at Edna Holloway's house, which was large enough to hold a crowd, and there was food in quantities that spoke to the generosity of rural communities when they decide someone deserves celebrating. There was a fiddle player from the south end of the county who played 3 hours of music in the Holloway's front room, and people danced on the wood floor with the particular enthusiasm of a community that does not get many occasions for dancing. Clara danced with Edna's youngest son, who was 9 and took the responsibility gravely. David danced with Frances and was not exceptional at it, which made her laugh, and she told him so, and he agreed with complete amiability, and they danced badly together for a while and did not care at all. They moved into the farmhouse together in the first week of December, which involved mostly the transfer of David's law books from the room above the hardware store, because the room above the hardware store had otherwise been quite empty. The law books required 3 trips with Ridley and a borrowed pack horse, and the enthusiastic assistance of Clara, who had strong opinions about where the books should be shelved and helped arrange them by size, which was not quite how David had organized them, but which he accepted with good grace. His practice moved to a small room off the main street that he was able to rent from the hardware store's owner, who was a practical man and recognized the value of having a lawyer on the block. He continued to build his client list through the winter more estate matters, a water rights case involving a farmer in the county's western section, a contract dispute between two cattle ranchers that he managed to settle without litigation, which both parties found surprising and satisfying. He became, by degrees, one of the fixtures of Millstone Creek, the way that competent and honest people become fixtures in small places, through accumulated trust and the quiet evidence of reliability. Frances planted the west field in the spring, adding it to the corn rotation she had begun the previous year. She had kept up the laundry business through the winter and had added 2 new customers, and the $5 monthly payments to the bank had been running for nearly a year. She was not prosperous, but she was stable, and stability, which she had not quite been able to believe in since Robert's death, was what she had wanted more than anything. She and David built the stability together. He handled the accounts, which he was good at, and she handled the animals and the fields, which she was better at than him, and they divided the household without discussion and without particular ceremony because neither of them was performing their life. They were simply living it. They argued occasionally over money once, and over Clara's schooling once, and once over something so trivial that neither of them could remember afterward what it had been, and made up with the directness that characterized everything they did with each other, which was to say they talked it through, and neither of them sulked. Clara, who had been an only child for 7 years and had expected perhaps to remain one, was informed in April of 1883 that she was going to have a sibling, and received the information with a pause followed by a series of very practical questions about timing, sleeping arrangements, and whether she would be expected to do additional chores, all of which Frances answered honestly, and Clara deliberated, and said that she thought on balance it was acceptable. The baby came in November, almost exactly a year after the wedding. A boy, healthy and loud, with David's dark hair and Frances's particular expression of total focus when engaged with something interesting, which he demonstrated from his first hour, by tracking movement across the room with an intensity that made the midwife laugh. They named him Thomas Robert Prescott Thomas for Edna's husband, who had walked Frances down the aisle, and Robert for the man whose land they were standing on, whose memory Frances carried not as a grief but as a foundation. Clara inspected Thomas with thorough, unsentimental attention and declared him acceptable, if somewhat loud. She was 8.5 now, reading steadily above her age level, and had strong opinions about horses, mathematics, and the correct way to make corn bread, all of which she expressed freely and argued for with the tenacity of someone who had absorbed both her parents' approaches to life. She helped with Thomas with the slightly proprietorial manner of an older sibling who considers herself somewhat responsible for the younger one's quality of care, and Thomas, as he grew, regarded Clara with the devoted attention of a small person who has identified who the most interesting people in the world are. The Christmas of 1883 was the first one that felt fully inhabited. Frances had decorated the porch with cedar branches, and there was a fire going in the fireplace that Robert had built in the house's first year, and which Frances had kept burning every winter since. Clara had made ornaments from scraps of ribbon and bits of wire, and they hung on the small cedar branch David had cut and brought in from the mesquite stand. Thomas was a month old and slept through most of the holiday with the philosophical serenity of an infant who has not yet developed concerns, though he woke loudly at 4 in the morning and could be heard expressing his opinions about it from the loft. David sat in the firelight on Christmas evening with Thomas in his arms and Clara asleep against his side and Frances across from him in the rocking chair that had been Robert's and which she had kept in its place by the fire, and looked at the life arranged around him, and thought that he had not believed, particularly, in the version of fortune that deposited you exactly where you needed to be, but he believed in it now. He said as much to Frances quietly in the firelight. She looked at him from the rocking chair. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I was in Harlan County in March of last year because of a land dispute that I had been brought in to resolve. When it was resolved, I could have ridden back to Austin and returned to my ordinary life. I nearly did." He paused. "I am not a person given to dramatic notions about fate, but I looked at that foreclosure notice and something about it, about the specific circumstances, about the name, about the fact that I was there and had the means to do something, would not let me pass it by." "And you came," she said. "And I came," he said. She looked at the fire for a moment. "Robert would have liked you," she said. "He had good instincts about people. He would have liked you right away." "I hope so," David said. "He would have," she said. "You are both the kind of man who does the right thing and doesn't make a performance of it." He appreciated that in people. David looked down at Thomas in his arms, who was sleeping with the total commitment of an infant's small fist curled against his own cheek. "I think of him sometimes," David said. "The land was his, the house. Clara carries his name." "Yes," Frances said simply. "And all of that is right. There is room for everything that was, David. There is room for what is now. They do not cancel each other out." He looked at her. She was firelit and certain and entirely herself, the woman who had stood in a courthouse with nothing but her voice and used it without flinching, the woman who had planted fields alone and raised a daughter and grieved and continued, and who was now looking at him with the particular quality of love that is past the stage of uncertainty and fully, quietly settled. "I know," he said. "I was not worried. I only wanted to say it." "I know," she said. "That is why I answered." The spring of 1884 brought the corn up early, and a small dispute about the water rights along the Eastern Creek line, which David handled efficiently, and which resulted in a written agreement that formalized the Fairchild land's access to the creek in perpetuity, something he had been wanting to get on record since the previous year. It also brought the news, which arrived by way of a letter from the State Banking Commission, that Gerald Cobb had been removed from his position at the Cattlemen's Trust following an investigation into his lending practices, which had involved not only Frances Fairchild, but at least 6 other families in the county, all of them widowed or otherwise vulnerable landowners who had been presented with loan instruments under questionable circumstances. The letter was addressed to Frances as one of the original complainants, and she read it at the kitchen table while David watched her face for her reaction. She read it through, folded it carefully, and placed it on the table. "Good," she said. "That is all," he said. "That is exactly all," she said. "What else would I say? He is gone. The families whose land can be recovered should have it, and I would like to plant the west field before the rain comes this afternoon." He looked at her with something that was well past admiration by now, but which he did not have a simpler word for, and said, "I will help with the west field." "I know you will," she said, and stood up and put her hat on. The letter about Cobb was, in some ways, the last piece of business from the year before. With it, everything from that spring, the fear, the courthouse, the 60 days that had run out, was finally and fully done. The land was theirs without complication. The man who had tried to take it was gone. The law had worked the way the professor in Austin had believed it should, which was for ordinary people, and David Prescott had had a hand in making it do so. And he was deeply satisfied by that, in the specific way that lawyers are satisfied when the law proves it can actually be used for the purpose it claims. He wrote a brief account of the case, somewhat anonymized, and sent it to a legal journal in Austin that published material on Texas property law, because the Henderson precedent deserved to be better known, and the question of mental capacity in contract signings was one that kept coming up in rural counties and needed clearer guidance. The journal published it in June. He received 2 letters from other attorneys in the state afterward, both of whom had similar cases pending and found the analysis useful. He answered both letters with the detailed, collegial directness that characterized his professional correspondence, and folded the whole episode into his practice as a thing completed. Summer came and ripened, and gave way to a fall that was golden and long, with cool nights and warm afternoons that seemed designed for the specific pleasure of being outside in them. Clara turned 9 in September, and received from her mother and David the gift of a proper writing desk for the loft, which she had asked for with the focused intensity of a child who knows exactly what she needs. She was now also in correspondence with a schoolteacher in the county's neighboring town who had agreed, after an exchange of letters initiated by Frances and composed in considerable part by Clara herself, to provide additional reading materials and exercises through the post. Thomas was nearly a year old and had progressed from the philosophical serenity of infancy to the extremely energetic mobility of a child who has discovered that the world is accessible by crawling and, increasingly, by pulling himself upright on the furniture and taking experimental steps. Clara found this development alternately impressive and alarming, as Thomas's trajectory was not always predictable and the kitchen had become an obstacle course. David found it mostly extraordinary, watching his son navigate the physical world with total commitment and no apparent sense of risk. On an October afternoon, Frances stood at the fence line of the south field watching Thomas take 3 uncertain steps across the grass toward the spot where Clara was sitting with her book, and felt the accumulation of the year rise in her the way that feeling sometimes does, not in a dramatic wave, but in a slow, comprehensive warmth that was almost too large for the chest to hold. Thomas reached Clara and sat down abruptly in the grass beside her, and Clara, without looking up from her book, put one arm around him with the automatic, encompassing gesture of an older sibling. David came up behind Frances and stood beside her at the fence, and they watched their children together in the October light. "Next spring," Frances said. "What about next spring?" he asked. "I want to expand the kitchen garden," she said, "and I have been thinking about putting in a small orchard along the south fence line. Peach trees, mostly. They do well in this soil. It would take a few years for them to produce, but we are going to be here," he said. "Yes," she said, "we are going to be here." He put his arm around her at the fence line, in the October afternoon, with Clara and Thomas in the grass below them, and the mesquite golden in the distance, and the creek running clear over its limestone bed at the bottom of the property. And she leaned into him in the way of someone who has found the right place to stand after a very long time of standing alone. She thought about the courthouse in March of 1882, and the woman she had been walking into it. The fear packed down into composure, the voice kept steady by pure determination, the 60 days that had run out and the $120 she did not have. She thought about standing up in that room with nothing but what she knew to be right and saying it anyway, saying every word of it, and the stranger who had risen before she finished, who had walked to the front of the room with statute numbers and gray eyes, and something in his manner that she had recognized even then as fundamentally trustworthy. She thought about how close it had all come to going differently, if he had not seen the notice, if he had ridden on to Austin, if she had said nothing in that courthouse, or had said something, and had it brushed aside without the legal weight that turned the judge's attention. She thought about the 240 acres under her feet, the house behind her, the children in the grass. She had fought for it. He had fought for it with her. And then they had built the rest of it together with the same practical, honest attention they brought to everything. "David," she said, "yes, I am glad you saw the notice." He was quiet for a moment and she could feel him smiling. "So am I," he said, "every day." Clara looked up from her book across the grass and observed her parents at the fence line with the calm, assessing gaze of a 9-year-old who has been taking accurate readings of the world for some time. "Thomas needs his hat," she called up to them. "The sun is on his face." Frances laughed, pushed away from the fence, and went down to her children, and David Prescott watched her go through the October afternoon with the particular quality of attention he had been giving her since March of the previous year and intended, he was fairly certain, to give her for the rest of his life. Thomas had a hat located and installed with some negotiation. Clara returned to her book with the satisfaction of a completed mission. The afternoon wore on in all its ordinary beauty, with the October light laying itself across the land in long gold stripes and the creek audible in the distance, and somewhere in the mesquite, a dove calling once, twice, and then going quiet. In the spring of the following year, they planted the peach trees. A dozen of them, along the south fence line, small and bare-branched and not particularly impressive in their first season, because peach trees are a long-term investment and both Francis and David understood long-term investments. They grew. Slowly and deliberately, the way that good things do, putting down roots in the Harlan County soil that Robert Fairchild had first claimed, and that Francis Fairchild had stood in a courthouse to keep, and that David Prescott had come alongside on a Sunday afternoon in early spring with nothing but 12 minutes of property law and the conviction that it mattered. By the summer of 1886, the peach trees were producing. Not enormously, not in the first year of production, but enough for Clara, who was 11 and had strong opinions about peach preserves, and had taken it upon herself to learn the process from Edna Holloway, to put up 14 jars that lined the kitchen shelf with their warm amber color through the fall and winter. Enough for Thomas, who was 3 and had decided that peaches were among the best things in the world, to eat from the tree with the total absorbed pleasure of a small person who has found something excellent. Enough for Frances to stand at the south fence line on a summer evening and think about the day she had planted them with her husband's hands alongside hers, and know that she had known, planting them, that they would be here for this. Frances was expecting again by the fall of 1886. The news arrived with the same calm certainty as most things Frances approached, and she told David on a Wednesday evening at the kitchen table with the matter-of-fact directness that was entirely her own. He looked at her, and what moved across his face was not surprise. He had been paying attention, as he always did, but a warmth so uncomplicated and full that it was almost undignified, which she found entirely endearing. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am very well," she said. "Good," he said, and then, because he could not help it, "Good." The baby arrived in the spring of 1887, another boy, who came into the world with the same dark hair as his father and the same absolute certainty as his mother. They named him James Daniel Prescott, and he slept through his first night with a composure that suggested either excellent temperament or misleading early behavior. And it turned out to be excellent temperament, because James was a calm and sunny child from the outset. Clara, who was 12 and had been a magnificent older sister to Thomas, assumed the same role toward James with the competent authority of an experienced hand. And Thomas, who was 4 and had been through the experience of acquiring a sibling once already, and found it on balance acceptable, regarded James with something that was nearly immediately recognizable as the particular affection of a middle child who has found his ally. The Prescott farm people in town had taken to calling it by the new name, though Frances sometimes thought of it still as the Fairchild land, because it was, and both names were true, was by 1887 a working, producing, lived-in place. The fields, the orchard, the kitchen garden, the 3 hens grown to 8 hens, the small additional stable David had built in the second year of their marriage to accommodate a second horse when Ridley began to show his age. The house itself had been expanded once, carefully and by degrees, adding a room off the back of the main structure that functioned as David's study during the day and a library in the evenings, its shelves now holding not only his law books but the accumulated reading of a house where both adults read seriously, and Clara had been reading above her age level since she was 8. Millstone Creek itself had grown and changed in the 5 years since the spring of 1882. The county had built a proper schoolhouse in 1884, which Clara attended, and which had been, in Frances's estimation, overdue. The Main Street had acquired a second general store and a telegraph office, which had transformed the nature of communication and commerce in the county in ways that were still being worked out. 2 new families from Missouri had settled on land in the county's northern section, and a cattle operation in the west had expanded significantly, bringing additional employment. The town was not large, but it was building. David's practice had grown proportionally. He had taken on a junior associate in 1885, a young man fresh from law school in Austin named Caleb Ward, who was 23 and earnest and technically precise, and who had moved to Millstone Creek with the slightly dazed quality of a person who has just understood that the world outside of university is quite different and is gamely adapting. David had mentored him with the same patient directness that characterized everything else, and by 1887, Caleb Ward was a competent practitioner in his own right who handled a significant portion of the practice's routine work. The Cobb matter had resolved without further drama. The 6 families who had been subject to similar practices had, through a combination of the State Banking Commission's intervention and the documentation that David had helped compile, recovered, or retained their properties. It had taken 3 years, but it was done, and it was the kind of completed thing that Frances returned to occasionally in her mind, not with bitterness, but with something that felt like satisfaction. The specific satisfaction of a problem that required a great deal of effort, and then, finally, was solved. On a warm June evening in 1887, with James sleeping in his cradle in the house and Thomas in bed and Clara reading by lamplight in the study, Frances and David sat on the porch in the summer dark and listened to the creek and the insects and the particular quiet of a farmstead that has settled into the end of a day. Frances was 36. David was 40. They had been married for almost 4 years, and the marriage was a solid, daily, deeply satisfying thing that neither of them felt the need to examine or perform. They were comfortable with each other in the way that only comes from years of honest attention, from arguments resolved and silences shared, and the ordinary accumulated weight of a life built together. "I was thinking," Frances said. "About what?" "About Clara," she said. "About school. She is 12, and she is reading at a level that the county schoolhouse cannot really address. I wrote to the teacher in Austin that I told you about from the correspondence course she has been doing. And there is a school," Frances said, "a proper academy, in Austin. It accepts girls, which is not as common as it ought to be. The teacher knows the head mistress. She thinks Clara would be considered." David was quiet, listening. "It is not for now," Frances said. "It would be in 2 years when she is 14. She would board during term, come home for Christmas and summer." She paused. "It is a long way." "It is," he said. "She wants to do it," Frances said. "I have not asked her directly, but I know my daughter. She wants more than the county schoolhouse. She wants more than the county, I think." "She is very like you," David said. "She is herself," Frances said. "Which is better?" He reached over and took her hand in the dark. "We will look into it properly," he said. "Write to the school, find out the terms. If it is right for her, we will find the means." "I know you will," she said. "That is not what I was wondering." "What were you wondering?" She was quiet for a moment. "I was wondering if it is all right to want her to have more than I had," she said. "More than this county, more choices." "It is completely all right," he said. "It is what she deserves." "Robert would have wanted it too," she said. "He always said Clara was going to do something remarkable." "He was right," David said. "Whatever form it takes." She squeezed his hand in the summer dark, and he squeezed back, and the creek ran over its stones, and the peach trees stood along the south fence line in their summer fullness, and the house behind them held their children and their books and the years they had built, and it was all exactly and precisely enough, which was more than enough, which was everything. The letter to the Austin Academy was written and sent in July. The response came in September, and it was positive, and the head mistress's note about Clara's correspondence coursework, which Frances had sent along with the letter, was warm and specific. There was a place for Clara in the autumn of 1889. Clara, informed of this at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning in September with the whole family present, went through a sequence of expressions that moved from surprise to the particular focused stillness of someone processing a very large piece of information to something that was unmistakably joy, contained and bright, the joy of a person who has been told that the thing they had been quietly hoping for is real. "Austin," she said. "Austin." Frances confirmed. Clara looked at her mother, then at David, then at Thomas, who was eating his breakfast and following the conversation with 4-year-old attention. Then she said, with a composure that was entirely her own and that Frances recognized with the particular bittersweet quality of a mother watching her daughter become more fully herself, "I will come home for Christmas." "Every Christmas," Frances said. "And summer," Clara said. "Every summer." Clara nodded once and returned to her breakfast, and the composure lasted until she was finished eating, at which point she came around the table and put her arms around Frances, and held on for a long moment in the way that she had not done since she was very small. And Frances held her back in the way that mothers hold daughters they are also letting go, which is with the complete and loving contradiction of a fierce grip that also means, "Go, go, go be who you are." The fall of 1887 settled into winter, and winter into the spring of 1888, and the farm and the family moved through the years with the good, accumulating momentum of things built right. James grew and bloomed. Thomas became 5 and then 6, and developed a consuming interest in everything mechanical, examining the pump and the windmill and the hinge mechanisms on the gates, with the focused attention of someone who is going to understand how things work and will not be deterred. David's practice continued its steady growth. Frances's land continued to produce, and the peach orchard was now reliably beautiful every spring, the pink blossoms coming out along the south fence line like a declaration that winter was genuinely done, that the land was alive, that things planted with care and patience came to fruit. The day Clara left for Austin in September of 1889 was a clear, warm Tuesday. David had borrowed a wagon for the trip, because the stage from the county seat ran once a week, and they had decided together that the family would drive her the first time, the whole family, which was to say Frances and David and Thomas, who was 6, and James, who was 2, and Clara herself, sitting in the back of the wagon with her trunk and her books and her expression of contained, forward-facing excitement that Frances looked at and thought, "There she is. There is the person she was always going to be." They left her at the academy on a tree-lined street in Austin with her trunk and a letter of introduction, and the 3 extra pairs of stockings that Frances had packed despite Clara's assurances that she had enough stockings. The headmistress was a brisk, capable woman who shook Clara's hand and addressed her directly, which Frances noted with approval. Clara shook the headmistress's hand and looked around the academy courtyard with the expression of someone who has arrived somewhere they intend to stay, and Frances stood beside David in the September sunlight and watched her daughter walk through the academy doors, and felt the simultaneous and contradictory fullness of loving someone so completely that their moving forward into the world is both a loss and the entire point. David put his arm around her shoulders. "She is going to be magnificent," he said. "Yes," Frances said, "she is." They drove back to Millstone Creek in the long September afternoon, with Thomas asking questions from the wagon bed and James sleeping against his brother's side, and the Texas landscape going by in its familiar colors of dust and mesquite and open sky, and Frances sat beside David on the wagon bench and was exactly where she was, which was on her way home. Home was the limestone house at the end of the track through the mesquite trees. Home was the south field and the peach orchard and the 8 hens and Ridley, old now and slow, but still moving, and the new horse that Thomas had named himself. Home was Clara's letters arriving on Fridays, full of what she was reading and who she had met and what she thought about Austin, letters that Frances saved in a box on the kitchen shelf. Home was Thomas in the yard taking the pump apart to see how it worked, and James following him with total devotion. Home was David at the kitchen table in the evenings with his law papers and a cup of coffee, present and real and entirely her own. Home was 240 acres in the eastern section of Harlan County, Texas, in the year 1889, land that a woman had stood up in a courthouse to keep, and a man had risen to help her hold, and which had become, in the 7 years since, not just a piece of ground but the whole shape of a life, 2 lives, braided together, and the children those lives had made. And the orchard and the fields and the creek and the cottonwood where Robert was buried, and the future that spread out ahead of all of them like land seen from a rise, vast and various and full of everything that had not happened yet. Frances Fairchild Prescott, 38 years old, stood on the porch of her house in the September evening and watched the last of the light go off the mesquite and thought of everything it had taken to still be standing here. She thought of the girl in Georgia who had not imagined Texas. She thought of the young woman who had come to this land with a husband full of hope and a wagon full of everything they owned. She thought of the widow who had walked into a courthouse with her voice and nothing else and used it to its full extent. She thought of the stranger in the back row who had risen before she finished. She thought of Sunday afternoons and barn light and a laugh that had surprised her by coming back. She thought of a man who had said what he meant and meant what he said, who had sat at her kitchen table for 7 years now and was still, every day, genuinely interesting to her, which she had come to understand was not a small thing but possibly the largest thing. David came out onto the porch with 2 cups of coffee and handed her one without ceremony, the way he handed her things, directly, without hesitation, as though of course they were for her. "Thomas has the pump in 4 pieces," he said. "Can he put it back together?" she asked. "He says yes," with some confidence. "Then let him try," she said. David looked at her with the gray eyes that had been watching her since March of 1882, that had seen her afraid and determined and grieving and planting and laughing and holding babies and arguing about schooling, and all the 1,000 other versions of herself she had been in the years since. He looked at her in the September evening on the porch of the house on the land she had kept, and she looked back at him, and between them, wordless and complete, was everything. "It is a good life," he said. "It is the best life," she said. The pump was reassembled correctly, under some advisory guidance from David that Thomas tolerated with the gracious condescension of a 6-year-old who mostly had it, but was willing to accept input. James celebrated its working by pumping the handle 12 times in a row. The hens went in for the night. The last of the September light faded from the mesquite, and the first stars came out over the Harlan County sky, the same stars that had been out there on a July night in 1882 when a man had told a woman what he felt and she had said, with the precision that was entirely her own, "Not unwelcome, not unwelcome." It had been the understatement of the decade, and she had known it when she said it, and he had known it too, and they had built the rest of their lives on the honest foundation of what it actually meant. The family went inside. The lamp was lit in the kitchen window. The limestone house held them, as it had always held them, as it would go on holding them through all the seasons still to come. The peach blossoms in the springs ahead, the corn in the summers, the golden Octobers and the cold, clear winters, and the long life of a family on land that had been worth every word of the fight to keep it. Outside, the creek ran over its stones in the dark, as it had run for longer than any person in Harlan County had been alive, and would run long after all of them had gone, carrying the cold water of the high plains down through the limestone and the mesquite toward the sea. And on the 240 acres through which it ran, in the house built of limestone with the cottonwood beside it, and the peach orchard along the south fence line, and the fields that produced every year, and the children that were growing, and the man and the woman who had found each other in the particular way that people sometimes do, not by accident exactly, and not by design exactly, but by the intersection of character and circumstance, and the willingness to be present for what the world offered. The lamp burned warm and steady in the kitchen window, visible from the track through the mesquite, a light that anyone coming down that road in the dark could see from a long way off. A light that said, "Here is where the living is. Come in from the road. You are welcome at this table. Come in from the road. You are welcome here."